Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY, and whether new or returning, it's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this episode, I'll be turning a lidded bowl from Spalted Beech blanks cast into lilac coloured epoxy resin. It's inspired by a bowl I did a couple of weeks ago. I'll drop a link below to that one. So without further ado, let's get into it. I've had the beech blanks for a while and they're covered in wax. It's painted on to stop them cracking whilst they're dry. That's all well and good, but the wax forms a barrier between the resin and the wood, so it needs to be removed before casting. I could have turned it off on the lathe, but I opted to use the large disc sander, which was okay, but the sanding disc kept getting clogged with wax and sawdust, so I had to use a block of rubber to keep it clean. With the wax removed, I could begin casting. After supergluing a waste block to the first blank, I mixed 3 batches of epoxy resin. It's my usual brand, added to the mixing cups at a 2:1 ratio, and then thoroughly mixed to the manufacturer's recommendations. The colour of choice is a heavy dose of white mica powder, a splash of purple mica powder, and a few drops of purple alcohol dye. I was hoping this would give me a mottled swirl pattern in the finished piece. As I was mixing, the colour didn't look great. I'd put too much white in it, or so I thought, and I was considering mixing another batch of purple, but with all that in the casting, I was risking it cracking whilst it was curing, so I stuck with the 3 batches and decided I had little choice but to carry on and see it through. So with all 3 batches in the casting bucket, I added some weight to hold the blank in place and put the whole thing in the pressure pot, screwed the lid down and added 50 to 55 psi, and then I left it in the workshop to cure overnight. It's the next day and time to remove the casting. The first impressions look good. The colours on top had separated, giving the mottled effect I was hoping for, and I couldn't wait to see the rest of it. When I removed the blank, things took a turn for the worse. There were voids all the way around the middle where the beech and the resin met, and some looked very deep. I'm not sure what caused it. Maybe it was residual wax melting and vaporising in the heat of curing resin, or did the wood soak it up? I wasn't sure what to do next. The way I saw it, I had 2 choices. Option 1, I could put it back in the casting bucket and add more resin and hope it filled the deeper voids. Or option 2, I could carry on, get it on the lathe and turn away the bad bits and see what I was left with, and I decided on the latter, thinking I could always recast it if necessary. So after chiselling off the waste block, I marked the centre on either end of the blank and drilled a hole for the woodworm screw. Then I fixed it to the lathe, using the tailstock to make it nice and secure. I got straight into turning the waste away. With the lathe spinning at around 600 RPM and using the Easywood Tools full-size finisher, I worked my way down to the timber blank. The resin was still on the soft side, but that was okay because I wouldn't be finishing the piece in this first session. Very quickly I got down to the Spalted Beech. Then I began roughly blending the lower section into the resin upper piece, and to my complete relief, most of the voids had gone. All that was left were 3 or 4 deeper holes, and I reckoned I would be able to fill them when I did the next stage. Satisfied I could repair the blank, I quickly cut a mortise in the base and turn the blank around so I could work on the top of the resin. The next stage would be to level the top and then glue on another Spalted Beech blank using epoxy resin. This would form the top of the finished piece. At the same time, I would be able to fill the last few voids. With the surface nice and level, I did a test fit, then I mixed a small amount of resin, coloured to match the rest. This was applied to both faces. Once the beech blank was in place, I used a tailstock to add pressure to hold it firmly in place. After a bit of cleanup, I thought it would be a good idea to use painter's tape to seal a joint until it cured, but that had to come off so I could get to the voids. Filling the voids was a simple case of pouring in the resin, waiting for it to settle, then topping it up, and it was surprising how much it took. But with that done, I left it overnight to cure. It's the next day and time to start turning, but first I drilled a hole so I could turn the blank around and refix it to the woodworm screw, and as usual I used a tailstock to secure it in place. Once the blank was nicely centered and secured in place, I turned the speed up to around 800 RPM and began removing material. The full-size finisher soon had the workpiece to round and well balanced, and the shaping could begin. For this, I switched to the 1/2-inch bowl gouge. Because of the height of the blank, very early on I decided this would have a pedestal. As I've said on other projects, I think the curves of the cutout show off the figuring in the wood, and this being my first spalted bowl, I wanted it to look good. Working on either side of the cutout, I gradually worked my way deeper into the blank. At the same time, I reduced the diameter of the base to suit the design. I was looking for a tapered shape from the base to the rim. With the camera moved to a different angle, you can better see how I form the cutout, and while shaping the upper part, I uncovered a small problem. The voids reappeared. I couldn't tell if these were new or the same as before, and there wasn't a lot I could do, so I continued. Whilst considering how I would fix the voids, I turned my attention back to the cutout. I wanted it to be much deeper and finish at a sharper angle, so I used a 3/8 detail spindle gouge. This is a more swept back grind, which would allow me to form the shape I was looking for. After removing what was left of the wax coating from the upper timber blank, I made the bold move of cutting away more material from the top section of the cutout. I hope this would expose more resin, making it look thicker. Using the skew chisel, I made a few more passes to refine the curve. It was when I stopped the lathe that I could see the full extent of the voids. After cutting a groove to mark a section that I would cut off for the lid, I decided to fill the holes with super glue. I didn't have time to wait for epoxy to cure. That would have set me back another day. The super glue seemed to do a great job of filling the holes, and once I applied the activator, I gave it a couple of minutes to cure, after which I used a skew chisel to clean up the surface. However, I wanted to refine the shape a bit more, so taking the 3/8 bowl gouge, I made a thin cutting pass over the voids. If you look closely at the back of my hand, you can see a wet line appear. It's uncured super glue. which meant I was basically back at square one. Using a skew, I cleaned up the tool marks and then I sanded with 80 grit to finalise the shape. Whilst doing this, I remembered I had some fast cure epoxy. I'd used it once before with good results, so I mixed up a small amount with matching colourant and set to filling the holes, making sure I got plenty in. I left the epoxy around 20 minutes to cure, after which it was still a bit soft but strong enough to hold. So to give it a bit more time, I used a thin parting tool to cut part way through the top section. Then when the repair was fully cured, I used a skew chisel to remove the waste and blend and fare the surface. Then I sanded with 80 grit. Repairs successfully completed, I turned my attention to the mortise in the base. I recut the outer edge with a 1/4 inch parting tool, then I cut a dovetail with a dovetail cutter. Next I removed the inner material with a gouge, and then I added some decorative rings, after which I sanded just the base from 80 to 400 grit. Next I applied a finish to just the underside. I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, applied sanding sealer, denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad, then Yorkshire grit, thoroughly cleaned away, and to finish, wood wax 22. With the workpiece turned around and fixed in the four-jaw chuck, I could continue. First I cut away the piece I would use for the lid. With that gone, I could work on the top section. Using the 1/2 inch bowl gouge, I faced off the top, shear scraping to get rid of the burning left by the parting tool. Then I began forming an OG shape from the outer edge with a raised centre. The rim of the bowl would be around 1.5 inches wide. Using the skew chisel, I blended the side into the upper section, and after a final check, I refined the curves on the top, then I could move on to forming the recess for the lid. I cut the lid recess with a parting tool to a depth of around 5mm 3/16. Then I cut a deeper recess next to it to form the outer edge of the opening into the bowl. With that done, I used a 3/8 bowl gouge to begin hollowing out. With the tail stuck out the way, I cut through the Spalted Beech and into the waste block in the resin. The waste block was cut from a piece of softwood, so I was soon through it and down to the timber blank in the base. For the remainder of the hollowing out, I used a round side cutting scraper. The trick with this tool is to have the tool rest set slightly higher than centre. Any lower and the cutting edge doesn't make good contact with the surface. But care has to be taken, as this thing will really dig in and you risk ripping the workpiece off the chuck. Using the scraper, I was able to remove material, cutting away at the side and up underneath the rim, stopping frequently to check my progress and resharpen the cutting edge. Occasionally I use the mid-sized carbide cutter to remove the heavier tool marks. Steadily I worked my way through the waste, keeping the cutting edge moving so I didn't take too much out in one spot. I was aiming for a wall thickness on the thinner side of 3/8 of an inch or 10mm. Not being able to see what I was cutting was a bit unnerving, especially on the underside of the rim, but I kept frequently checking and I was soon down to the last few cuts. A final pass with a bowl scraper to smooth the bottom into the side, and a quick sanding with 80 grit, and that's the inside more or less done. With the top section to shape, the lower section needed a bit of work to balance things up. The base looked too thick, and the diameter needed reducing to match where the resin and wood met. Using the bowl gouge, I removed the bulk of the material, paying a lot of attention to the open blade so I didn't get a catch on the opposite side. That done, I switched to the spindle gouge to cut away the last little bit. A final tidy up on the outer edge of the rim, and then I sanded from 80 to 400 grit on the wood, continuing on the resin up to 3000 grit. Then I applied the finish. I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, and then I applied sanding sealer. 2 coats, denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Up next, Yorkshire grit, just a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Next, the resin polishing, beginning with Mirka Polar Shine 10, a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away and followed with Polar Shine 5, another single coat, thoroughly cleaned away to leave a deep shine. Then I used a single coat of Wood Wax 22. The Spalted Beech soaked this up as it was quite porous. This was buffed away to leave it with a deep lustre. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax to seal and protect the surface. Next was the lid, using the coal jaws to hold the blank and the tailstock to clamp it in place. I first faced it off, then I marked the outer diameter of the recess in the bowl. Next, I cut a recess and made it wide enough so that I could offer up the bowl to test the fitment. It took a couple of goes, but with that done, I formed a dish in the middle to reduce the weight, and it also looked nice. With the underside of the lid done, I sanded from 80 to 400 grit and added a finish, which I'll quickly go through. First, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, then I applied sanding sealer, denibbed as usual, then Yorkshire grit, thoroughly cleaned away, and finished with Wood Wax 22. I fixed the bowl back on the lathe and sat the lid on top, held in place with the tailstock. Very carefully I began to remove the waste material. The plan here was to cut through to the underside. After I broke through, I was able to remove the outer ring and then concentrate on shaping the top, all fairly straightforward. I used the bowl gouge, shear scrape in a gentle curve, and then the skew chisel to finish the outer edge and blend and fair the surface. shaping done, I removed the bowl from the lathe and used a piece of MDF between the lid and the chuck, holding it firmly in place with a tailstock. Then I sanded from 80 to 400 grit and added the finish, the same as the underside, but with the addition of some Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. All done, just one more bit to make, the knob for the lid. For this I used African blackwood. This was partway finished from another project, so I used it, getting it roughly to shape with a spindle gouge and then finishing it with a skew. I used the parting tool and preset calipers to cut the locating pin, and then I sanded it to 400 grit before applying the finish, which I think you've seen enough of, so I'll skip to the last bit. I cut the piece free with a small pull saw, and then I super glued it to the lid using black star bond. And that's it, another project finished, and I have to say I'm very pleased with this one. Despite the initial problems, this has turned out incredibly well. The Spalted Beech against the Lilac resin looks stunning. I think it may be my current favourite, and I hope you like it as well. Let me know what you think, and I'd be interested to know if you have any suggestions for future projects. But with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, a thumbs up will be great, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.